birds, when they're nesting, they keep coming back and forth from the nest, and they create this really characteristic pattern of movement that we can pick up from GPS data. And we can use that for two things. We can use it to find nests retroactively. We can say, hey, this bird moved in this certain way. It means that it nested here and at this time. After the fact, we can find that out. And then based on how long it kept returning to the nest for, we can say this attempt was likely successful. This bird likely was successful at reproducing and fledging some chicks.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Vandal Theory, a podcast about science and research at University of Idaho. I'm Danae Lenz. I'm your host for the day, and I am the External Communications Coordinator at U of I. And I am joined by Lee. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Danae. I'm Lee Cooper, science writer and editor here at University of Idaho.
So today we're going to talk about tracking animals' migration patterns. So to kick us off, I have a question, and I want to know, what is your favorite migratory animal fact?
Oh, this could go on for hours. Let's see. Favorite migratory animal fact. I think one of my favorites is the fact that not all, but a good portion of ruby-throated hummingbirds, they migrate from the U.S. down to Central America, and some of them go by land, but a number of them go to Florida as their last stop and then actually fly across the Gulf of Mexico, which it's a hummingbird. And that's amazing. They're so small, but they go across the entire Gulf. That's just bonkers to me. And I imagine them when I'm anthropomorphizing them, like getting all like psyched up at the edge of Florida and like, you know, football players before a game. Yeah, getting all ready to go and then taking off. And that's probably not how that actually happens.
I have to say, I did not know that fact. That is incredible. I have always been fascinated by salmon. Just their like ridiculous 200 plus mile trek upstream, like battling the current, battling predators, all to get to their spawning grounds. And I just think that's such an incredible, motivating story.
It really is. And there's actually, for extra bonus fact, there are actually fish who do the opposite. The American eel actually is born in the Sargasso Sea, travels inland to grow up, and then travels back out to spawn and die in the ocean. So it goes both ways.
Animals are fascinating. And we're actually going to learn more interesting animal facts today. Our guest today is Simona Picardi. She's an assistant professor of wildlife ecology and management in U of I's College of Natural Resources. She studies how animals move across landscapes and what secrets their movements reveal. In this episode, she explains how tracking technology and data analysis help uncover patterns in wildlife behavior, and how this research can guide strategies to protect habitats and wildlife populations. Are you ready to get into it?
Let's take off.
Hi, Simona. Welcome to the Vandal Theory.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, definitely. So I am an assistant professor in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Sciences at the University of Idaho. And my lab does research on animal movement ecology. So we study how animals move and what drives those movements and what the consequences of those movements are.
What does animal movement research look like in practice? And what kind of questions can it help answer?
Yeah. So animals move to find food, to find mates, to find conditions that are suitable for them in terms of temperature, in terms of precipitation, environmental conditions in general that they can thrive in. And then they also move to avoid risks such as predators or disturbances. And so by looking at their movements, we can understand a lot about their behavior and their decision making. So movement ecology, it's a discipline that's relatively young, and the development of this discipline has been fueled by technological developments and technology advancements. So GPSs, like the GPS positioning system, is actually only a few decades old. And being able to use GPSs, we don't even think about it because we all have a GPS in our pocket with our phones, right? But it's actually a relatively young technology. Using this technology, we've been able to actually put GPSs on animals to track their movements and to find out where they go. And so, thanks to this technology, we've been able to map movements that we previously were not able to observe. Things like the migration of Arctic terns from literally one pole to the other, or there was a study that a few years ago showed the movements of this one individual fox that walked on sea ice all the way from, the top of Norway all the way to Greenland. So these amazing movements that we would not be able to witness otherwise, we're now able to document based on this technology. And so as the technology has gotten better, the tags have become smaller and smaller, so we can put GPSs on smaller and smaller animals. And besides mapping movements, what we can do with this data is understand how animals make decisions. Where do they go and why? What are the factors that determine whether an animal chooses to go a certain direction or another? And so that can inform things like habitat protection and conservation planning. Recently, there's another application of these data which focuses on finding information on key life events that can happen within the life of an animal. So, for example, when does an animal reproduce, or when does it die, and why does it die, and why does it succeed or fail at reproducing? So really providing insight on things that are beyond movement, but using movement as kind of our lens into our window into those events.
You've also helped develop a method called Nestor. What is it, and how does it change the way researchers study animal movement?
It's not really a new way of tracking. We use the same tracking methods as other studies, and it's mostly based on GPS tracking technology. But what we do with the GPS data after we get it, that's where it differs from existing methods. It's an analysis tool. Essentially, we take the GPS data that we get from the tags that are put on birds, in this case specifically, and we use these data to get information about reproduction. So basically, birds, when they're nesting, they keep coming back and forth from the nest, and they create this really characteristic pattern of movement that we can pick up from GPS data. And we can use that for two things. We can use it to find nests retroactively. We can say, hey, this bird moved in this certain way. It means that it nested here and at this time. After the fact, we can find that out. And then based on how long it kept returning to the nest for, we can say, this attempt was likely successful. This bird likely was successful at reproducing and fledging some chicks. Whereas this other bird didn't return for long enough that it could have completed the attempt, and so it likely was an attempt that failed. So the analysis tools is new. And yes, we developed it a few years ago and implemented it into an open source software package that people can download and use. And so it has been used by researchers worldwide on 11 different bird species. And these include wading birds, raptors, seabirds, waterfowl, all sorts of different birds, which is really cool. So what it does is it lets us find out information about the location of nests and whether they were successful or not without having to go in the field. Before this method, we would have to go out in the field and find the nests. And that's not always easy to do, depending on where the birds are nesting, right? Some birds nest on cliffs that are really hard to access, or some birds are really secretive, and so their nests are hidden in vegetation that's super thick and really difficult to get through. And even for birds that nest in locations that are more accessible, it costs a lot of resources and money to go out, get a field crew out, get enough personnel on the ground to find the nests and collect information on their location and success. So being able to get all of that information without having to go in the field is kind of a game changer. There's a study that was done on martial eagles, and it showed that over a time frame of 10 years, Nestor was a cheaper method than traditional field methods, and it reduced carbon emissions by 200%. Think about all those trucks that don't have to go in the field and all those, all the fuel that you need to put in those trucks to make the data collection happen, unless you can do it remotely. And so there's serious advantages to using this method.
What are some of the most interesting things that you've learned?
So using this method, Nestor, one of the species that I used to develop this method was wood storks, which are large wading birds that I worked on while I was a researcher at the University of Florida. And so wood storks are these large wading birds that live in the southeastern U.S. and other parts of the American continent. And in the U.S., they mostly historically bred in the Everglades, in the Florida Everglades. They are partially migratory, which means that part of the population migrates every year, and they mostly migrate to elsewhere in the southeast. It's not a very long distance migration. But part of the population actually stays resident. And so it stays in the same place year round. And so one of the things that we were able to show using Nestor was that the resident individuals tend to nest and forage near urban areas in South Florida. And in addition to that, we found that these resident individuals that forage near cities also tend to have higher nest survival. So they tend to be more successful at completing a nesting attempt successfully, which brings them an advantage that could be potentially selected for or against. And so this is interesting because it makes us speculate, first of all, is this a recent phenomenon? Are birds becoming resident because they have these readily available, abundant food sources year-round, or was the population always partially migratory? And this we don't really know. We don't have information on historical migratory patterns. So we can't really answer that question. But the other question that could come to mind is, okay, could these migratory patterns change because resident birds are currently getting an advantage from the availability of human food? So we can't really say for sure because there's lots of missing pieces. We don't know if the behavior of these animals is heritable, and so if it can be under natural selection. We don't know if the higher nest survival could be compensated for by other things like adult survival, for instance. And so we can't really tell for sure if we expect the migratory patterns of wood storks to change in the future. But it is an interesting element that makes us speculate and wonder about that.
If the species that normally migrates were to become more resident, what might that mean for the ecosystems they move through?
Yeah, so we don't know that the migration patterns are going to change necessarily. So the fact that the resident individuals have higher nest survival could mean that they're getting a selective advantage and therefore that they're going to become more frequent in the population, that residency behavior is going to become more frequent in the population over time. And this has happened in other bird species that have started to rely on human food sources and that have gone from being completely migratory to being completely resident because functionally they don't need to migrate anymore. They have food in one place year round, right? So we could expect that. We don't really know that that is going to happen in this case because there's a lot of ifs. There's a lot of uncertainty around, okay, is this genetically heritable? So we can't say that for sure. But if wood storks were to become more resident, this could have different implications. In terms of negative aspects, there's a potential for crowding effects. If all the individuals spend the entire year in the same place, this could lead to crowding, which is conducive to disease transmission. And so there could be easier spread of disease between birds. We also don't know how changing migration patterns could affect the ecosystem on a bigger scale in terms of altering nutrient cycles. These birds move across the landscape, and when they do that, they deposit nutrients in the water, in the soil, and removing that source of nutrients could change vegetation dynamics or other ecosystem processes in ways that we don't even know and we can't really anticipate easily.
I also imagine there could be some side effects of these birds like eating McDonald's every day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I should have, I talked about human food sources, and I want to be a little bit more specific about that. There was a study done by another researcher at the same time as when I was working on this project, and she was looking at the diet content of wood stork chicks in urban colonies and found chicken nuggets, French fries, chicken wings, you name it, literally junk food. So these birds are eating a lot of junk food. And yeah, we don't really know what the effects are on their body condition, for example. Definitely, these are calorie-dense foods, and it takes a lot of calories to grow a wood stork nestling. It takes about 16 kilograms of fish. This is what they normally eat. Wood storks are entirely fish eaters. Their diet is almost 100% fish normally. And it takes 16 kilograms of fish to grow one wood stork nestling. So it takes a lot of calories. So having a really calorie-dense, widely abundant food source could potentially be really valuable for these birds. But we don't know whether the food quality also matters and how it affects their body condition and their health. So there could definitely be some unintended effects of eating junk food that we don't know about.
Always another question to be asked, huh?
Definitely.
What are some of the broader implications of the work that you do?
The main implication of this work is that it lets us get information about the factors affecting nest survival in birds, and this is critical for conservation. We're facing a biodiversity crisis, and animal populations decline when more individuals die than they are born. So understanding reproduction and the factors affecting how many individuals are born is critical to implement conservation actions. So getting this information on a larger scale than we could do by traditional field methods is really valuable because it helps us get more of that information on a scale that is informative for implementing conservation.
This kind of data can ultimately inform management decisions, right?
Yes.
So how does it move from research into policy?
You need information on all the pieces, on survival, on reproduction, on all the pieces that determine what happens to a population. And you can use these to develop models that predict what happens to the population under this conservation or this management scenario or another management scenario. And that can help policymakers make decisions on, okay, this intervention gets us closer to the outcome that we want.
Okay, I know you have to have some other cool things going on in your lab right now. So what are you working on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as a whole, my team is focusing on the impacts of human activities on animals. And we really study a variety of different species. A lot of the work that's going on right now focuses on large ungulates. So, for example, we are studying the effects that wildlife-friendly fence improvements have on pronghorn, who are terrestrial migrants. And so they migrate over really long distances. And along these migrations, they run into fences, which are really problematic for them because they're not good at jumping over them. And they try to scoot underneath instead. And so there's been a lot of interest. Managers have been implementing these wildlife-friendly fence improvements, which make it easier for pronghorn to go under fences and pass through them. So we're trying to quantify the benefit that we get from these fence improvement interventions. Another project that we are working on currently, together with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, is we're looking at the effects of winter recreation on mule deer and elk. So specifically, we want to know, we know that animals respond to recreationists, right? We know that they might slow down their movements or get startled and flee, or they might change the way they use the habitat. So we know that their behavior changes in response to recreation. But what we don't know is how much this matters for the population in terms of how well the individuals survive and reproduce. So we're studying this, and yeah, this is a project that just started, and I'm really excited about what we're going to find out.
To wrap up, what's the biggest thing you hope people take away from this conversation?
I would say, we collect hundreds of thousands of locations of wild animals every day with these tags that are deployed on so many different individuals of different species. So I think the exciting part about this work is that we can put these data to good use with novel methods that help us make the most of this gold mine of information. And it can really make the difference in informing conservation actions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been great.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
So, Lee, what did you think of that conversation?
Oh, I always love Simona. I've worked with her before. She did a really nice talk for us, a pop talk. If people want to see actually that starburst that happens of movement where the birds are going and coming from their nests, check out her video, which will be linked in the description. I think for me, one of the things that I think is hard for people to wrap their head around is how hard it is to actually track these nests. I remember I worked in Minnesota for a while, and along the shore of Lake Superior, there's lots of these cliffs, and peregrine falcons will roost there. And we actually had a day where we had to go out, and I was helping. I didn't get to actually do this, but I was helping the director of the operation rock climb down to the peregrine falcons. We actually took the babies out of the nest, put them in this little nice little suitcase, padded suitcase, pulled it up the hill. You're checking its health, you're banding it, then they go back down to the rock climber. They're put back in the nest. Throughout all of this, the mom is dive bombing us and everything. And then there was volunteers who would sit on an adjacent cliff and with a telescope and check in on the babies to see if they're happening. So that's like a lot of work. So she's not wrong that like the amount of labor and funds that you need to actually track this and get enough data off enough birds that you're going to be able to say something definitive. Yeah. What her work does could save a lot of funds and animal species.
That story is wild. I never would have imagined that scenario, but now it's stuck in my head and I love it.
A suitcase full of peregrine falcon chicks is the cutest suitcase in the world.
Indeed. Something that she brought up that I just thought was interesting. I think this is probably the case for a lot, if not all, scientific communities, but the more questions you get answered, the more questions you have. So I really love that part where we were talking about the wood storks eating junk food, because it's kind of an entertaining topic, but then, okay, so it could be positive for them, it could be negative for them, but all we know right now is that there's a population of wood storks living in cities, basically. And it's just, there's always a new question that needs to be answered, and it's probably never ending.
I also found that fascinating. Specifically the part where she talked about how it's going to change like the nutrient cycle of the area. I mean, even going back to your example of favorite animal migration facts, the salmon. I know salmon change the entire ecosystem around their spawning grounds. You take them away, you block that stream somehow, that entire area is going to change because the bodies of the dead salmon aren't fertilizing that stream anymore. It amazes me how, a small change in migratory patterns, whether it's because they're now staying in one location, but that means they're leaving a different location, how those are going to domino through the entire ecosystem. It's amazing to me.
No, I agree. I thought about that particular bit a lot because, yeah, like if a bird that used to migrate is no longer migrating, they're carrying pollen and stuff with them. So like maybe plants aren't getting pollinated, or like when they land, they're, food for some predator, and then all of a sudden that predator doesn't have any food. There's so many different things that could possibly happen.
Yeah. Oh, it's just amazing how all of it's connected.
Thank you for listening to the Vandal Theory. You can visit our website at uidaho.edu/Vandal Theory to learn more about our research. Email us at vandaltheory@uidaho.edu. We are on all of the podcasting platforms. Please rate and review and subscribe. I'm Danae Lenz.
And I'm Lee Cooper.
Thanks for joining us.